Hi everyone, and welcome to our 7th session of Knowing Through Sound, our open program here at the School of Arts from Universidade Católica de Portugal. Today we will be talking about complexity, non-linearity, emergency and knowledge, so I'm sure we're up for a great session, particularly because our guest is Warren Neidich, and his work will certainly guide us smoothly through these concepts. So before entering our session, though, I would like to remind you that these sessions are available on the School of Arts Facebook, and they are recorded, so you can access them, our previous talks, anytime you find convenient. And you should do so, because we've been welcoming some very interesting guests. And today is my great honor to introduce Warren Neidich. I have to thank Diogo Tudel and José Alberto for giving me this role and for preparing this program. So thank you guys, thank you both. I also have to thank the production team for accommodating these difficulties. So I'll briefly introduce our guest and then leave some possible paths in which I believe his work intertwines with this open program and our courses here. Then we'll have time to enjoy his presentation, and afterwards, in about an hour or so, we'll have time for questions and answers. And I do urge you to participate. By all means, speak in Portuguese if you have to, write in Portuguese on a chat. So just, I'll try to translate if that is a problem. And I think it's always interesting to hear a question, so please participate. Now, about Warren Neidich, I'll start by his biography. And I did try to choose among the many tentacles of his activity, just the ones I would find relevant. But it turned out that I could not exclude any of it. So I'll just go through it all. It's going to be a bit long, but I think it will lay the ground for better and read his work, I believe, and I hope. So Warren Neidich has studied photography, neuroscience, medicine, and architecture. Therefore, he brings to any discussion platform a unique interdisciplinary position that he calls trans thinking. So I think we should all try to tune into that frequency if we can. He currently uses video and neon to create cross-pollinating conceptual text-based works that reflect upon situations at the border zone of art, science, and social justice. His performative and sculptural work, Pizzagate Neon, and a large hanging neon sculpture recently on display at the 2019 Venice Biennale, analyze the relations of fake news, networked attention economy, evolving techno-cultural habitus, and the co-evolving architecture of the brain. Now, some of these concepts, like the fake news and networks attention economy, they've been recurrent in our courses, and so I think that it's going to be fun to see it from another perspective today. And his recent conceptual project, Drive by Art, Public Sculpture in this moment of social distancing, in which you visit the artwork in the safety of your car, opened in the South Fork of Long Island and Los Angeles. He's founder and director of the SASFI Summer Institute of Art, a theory-intensive postgraduate course that attracts students worldwide, operating in Los Angeles, New York City, and Berlin. You'll find plenty of information about these courses, and I think it's really interesting to check it out. So there are 4 major concepts at play that are easily identifiable in his biography. And I would say it's neuroaesthetics, cognitive architecture, cognitive capitalism, and cognitive activism. So on these lines, in '96, he founded artbrain.org and the journal Neuroaesthetics, which is still active today. And he also created the first conference on neuroaesthetics, as well as a department at the Goldsmiths. So he co-edited with Deborah Hauptmann the book Cognitive Architecture, From Biopolitics to New Politics. And I think this would be kind of an interesting thing to revisit nowadays, I would say. Thereafter, he edited 3 volumes of the Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism. His glossary on cognitive activism was published for the opening of his solo exhibition, Rumor to Delusion, at the 2019 Venice Biennale. And now these ideas seem to be fitting yet another concept, that of activist neuroaesthetics, which I think we'll be here about today. So given this introduction, as you can imagine, when Diogo and José contacted me to moderate this session, I was kind of overwhelmed, but immediately accepted. And here I leave you with a brief set of proposals for reading Warren Neidich's work, So these are possible positionings, inquiries, and plenty of paths to follow. And this is my small contribution to this session, where I tried interfacing art, science, and social justice in Warren Neidich's artworks. So I think that there is always an experience of excitement when navigating an overwhelmingly interesting aggregate of information. There are too many important threads to follow and too many possibilities to weave them. Resonations at a sensitive, emotional, and cognitive level. And such was the nature of my encounter with Warren Neidich's work. So when facing such an imminent incapacity for synthesis, I often return to the concept of interface as a complex of mediation. So it helps me to navigate and allows me to observe ever-changing connections, because my standing point is in the in-between space. From there, I can follow the path of the activated interstices between different elements. So this is how I hope to see Warren Neidich's work at work, doing what it does, combining art, science, and social justice, theory and practice, concepts and instances. In an interdisciplinary position, and exercising the possible trans-thinking that I'm able to do, I feel confident to grasp the originality of these impure territories for creation. Neidich's work is in the border zone of art, social justice, and science. So this means not only recognizing the tangencies between these fields, but to move further or deeper to the very fabric that dynamically links photography, neurosciences, medicine, and architecture. And the artist lets this in-betweenness be patent in these artworks. I believe this is what Warren Neidich means by saying he's a wet artist. He affirms that he reverses the conceptualist movement that withdrew sensitivity from their artwork in the search for a pure cognitive experience. Well, an interdisciplinary practice, from my point of view, cannot be dry. Its nature is not one of restraining or sustaining cleavages or even withholding possibilities in the search for purity. On the contrary, it is inclusive, open, and embraces the crossbreed, the hybrid. To be open is to be changeable, to be plastic, to leave all options available. To be open is to be unlimited and to accept stimuli that comes from without, from the environment, to recognize the influence of a milieu and to act upon it. And to act is the possibility to change, perchance to attain the truth and reestablish justice. Wet, through moist media, in Ascott's assertion. So in this firm belief that it is through the interface that media are experienced and therefore instantiated in space, time, and matter, this reference to moist media leads me to question the materiality of Neidich's work. Artworks matter. It is absolutely necessary to consider matter in its trinity along with space and time, and to do that through light. Understanding space-time implies considering the masses, the particles and their behavior, namely through its relation with light, something very appropriate in this digital dematerialization era. So even more appropriate is to consider light art in this digital dematerialization era. So immediately comes to mind the artist's text-based neon sculptures, with their light materiality. In their network textual arrangements, they open possibilities of interconnection. They embrace complexity and non-linearity. And today, Warren Neidich will be talking about noise, indeterminacy, and the brain without organs. So, without further ado, I'll pass it on to you, and please feel welcome to our school, Warren.
Oh, well, thank you for that beautiful introduction, and thank you for taking the time to think and cogitate on my work. I am deeply moved, so thank you for that. And thank you also for all of you for inviting me here. I only hope that I can live up to your expectations. I'm going to not talk about my neon or my architectural theories, unfortunately, today, or I'm not going to speak about wet conceptualism, but I am going to use this this formatting, this procedure, this dispositif of activist neuroaesthetics to approach this topic that I was asked to speak about today, which is noise. I would like you to understand a few things. First of all, I'm going to show my lecture, my slides, and the text of my lecture is written on my slides. I find that's a lot easier for people to be able to read along with me, and also it slows me down so that I can speak, not so rapidly, because I have a tendency to speak rapidly. So I just wanted you to know that. The other thing is that you can ask me questions whenever you want. And the third thing is you have to understand that for me, a PowerPoint is a medium, is another medium. It's like painting or sculpture or photography or video. It's another medium. And I look at this lecture as an artwork. And that is the key that leads me to another key that I would like to communicate to you. by patients who are unable to move or communicate through normal pathways because of spinal cord injury, so-called locked-in syndrome. Instead, they to move a mouse or cursor on a screen that then causes an action like controlling a robotic arm or wheelchair. That's a very, very good thing. And here we have a woman who's controlling, next slide, please. Sorry, I'm not being good about that. Next slide, please. And here from Brown University, news from Brown, people with paralysis control robotic arms using brain-computer interfaces. And here we see a woman who's tetraplegic. She can't move any of the limbs of her body, but she learns on the right side in the picture, on the right upper quadrant. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little box, and that box is connecting to her brain, a series of electrodes, and then transmits a signal to a computer, which then codes those brain waves into signals that this robotic arm can be manipulated with. And in this case, the robotic arm is bringing a drink to this woman who's never fed herself or had a drink in this way, has always had to depend on people. This is an amazing thing, and we should embrace it and laud it. Here is science doing something that is incredible. Finding the COVID vaccine in such a short period of time, having the skill to understand RNA viruses, using them as templates. Amazing. We have, and so I don't want to sound like I'm being too critical or negative of science. I'm not. I embrace science. However, I'm critical of it. But I'm critical in a way that artists have always been critical of science, and I love, I love pataphysics, for instance. I'm a very Duchampian. I'm very very interested in Marcel Duchamp and his work and the retina and the gray matter of the brain and all of those wonderful things he talks about in his conversation with Pierre Carbon. I'm very much into it, and but at the same time, we have to use humor and we have to use comic relief, and we have to use criticism. And because art is it investigates the same disciplinary fields like memory. How many different cultural memory conferences have there been? Memory is something that artists and cultural theorists are working with, but neuroscientists work with memory, So there are all these different fields: perception, sensation, cognition, all these different disciplinary spheres that neuroscience shares with artistic interventions, but both use very, very different methodologies to investigate them. And the artistic methodology is of greater or equal value to the scientific methodologies. For me, they both are important, but they come out with very different facts. Artists produce artistic facts. And I'm not going to get into activist neuroaesthetics today, but just to throw that in there then. So in her book, we're going on with Zuboff. In her book, Surveillance Capitalism, Zuboff states, although some of these data are applied to product or service improvement, the rest are declared as a proprietary behavioral surplus fed into advanced manufacturing processes known as machine intelligence and fabricated into prediction products that anticipate what you will do now, soon, or later. Finally, and this is the key to my whole lecture and why noise is so important. Finally, these predictions products are traded in a new kind of marketplace for behavioral predictions that I call behavioral future markets. The political effects of behavioral future markets are widespread and are not simply contained in the sphere of advertising, but reach out to embrace insurance company data, finance, as well as policing. Zuboff expresses this in a terse declaration, again from Surveillance Capitalism. I consider surveillance capitalism's operations as a challenge to the elemental right to the future tense, which accounts for the individual's ability to imagine, intend, promise, and construct a future. Today, I want to wager in the course of this lecture that noise, indeterminacy, and other forms of stochastic phenomena erupting in the social, political, cultural milieu and the material brain, either naturally or human-made, represent forms of dissensus in the war against advanced forms of the big other. Can you imagine the consequence of a transition from real subsumption, in which everything is work, to what I am calling neural subsumption, where our memories, both conscious and unconscious, are used for laboring? Instead of data and big other being generated by typing and clicks on a mouse, it was generated from our thoughts in the form of brainwaves, coded and fed into advanced synthetic connectome, and then fed back upon an unsuspecting subject. Because as I showed you, the brainwaves coming from that tetraplegic patient, which are then coded and then used to move a robotic arm or a wheelchair, if the codes are known, another kind of synthetic brain called a synthetic connectome could elaborate commands that go the other way, So a new form of power, a new form of neural power. Noise, for me, represents a means to recuperate our futures and our free choice in the future. And everyone's always talking about, from that book about capitalism by Capellet, the French sociologist, that artistic interventions and innovation is always being recuperated by capitalism. But I think it goes the other way around. We have the power to recuperate capitalistic inventions as well. So art has tremendous art power, and I want to talk about art power in this way. It can recuperate as well. It can recuperate capitalist inventions and innovations. So here is a connectome, and this is what I'm talking about. This synthetic brain that could be even greater than a computer. It's all of the data. It is the data set that describes the network of elements and connections forming the human brain. And I am speculating that a synthetic connectome situated remotely will form an integral part of a complex technology called the wired brain. I want to inflate Slavoj Žižek's idea of the wired brain, which he expresses in his latest book, Hegel, A Wired Brain. There he contends, wired brain refers to a direct link between our mental processes and a digital machine, a link which, while it enables me to directly trigger events in reality with a mere thought, I think about something like starting my air conditioner, the computer deciphers my thought and triggers the air conditioner. It also enables the digital machine to control my thoughts. Singularity refers to the idea that, by the way of directly sharing my thoughts and experiences with other, a domain of global shared mental experience will emerge. Okay, so we go to the next slide. Sorry, I didn't tell you that. Okay, so that's my thesis, right? I'm saying that noise and indeterminacy are dispositives at the hands of artists, musicians, writers, people in theater, performers that have the capacity to disrupt these overlording of the new neural capitalism that is our future. And that is something that we need to be aware of, right? Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not being only critical. I also embrace the incredible wonderfulness of it all, right? I mean, here we are. I'm using this amazing, it's not Zoom, but it's something like Zoom, right? I'm using this. We're talking. We're able to communicate 5,000 miles away from each other. I mean, there's something about it that I want to embrace. But at the same time, we need to know what its negative side effects are. It's what it's called, its negative externalities. And we want to be aware of them. So just like the virus, there seems to be some people who, with the vaccine, have are sharing some sort of antigenic response with platelets and have a hemorrhagic problem with it. You know, they're getting blood clots. 7 out of, 36 million people have had blood clots. And because of that, the certain vaccines have had to be, put on a slow assembly line. Just like that we want to make sure the vaccine is perfect. We want to figure out what it is that is causing that hemorrhagic problem. We need to know what are the problems of the new neural link and the new Facebook, thought to typing apparatuses that are just around the corner. Because if we look at the 19th century and we look at the stereoptic card of the 19th century in around the 1850s, which was a very fascinating thing for French society, the stereoptic card where you see a kind of depth when you look at through this apparatus. And then 150 years later, we have virtual reality, and we are embedded in a simulation which is seamless. The same can be said about the new technologies that are being made today. So even though we have this these brain-computer interfaces being used for tetraplegics, and also they're already being used for in various forms for video games. Who knows when 25 years from now, what's going to happen? I'm speculating that technology, because all the money that's involved, and also because neural capitalism, which I'm not going to get into, but neural capitalism is part of this new stage of neoliberal. We should call it neoliberal neural capitalism. There's so much money and profit to be made that the kinds of critique that needs to be, that needs to be used to evaluate what are the consequences of these things, sometimes are not done sufficiently. So I want to try in my own little way to communicate that to you, and maybe some of you out there will have the opportunity to to look into this in a deeper way, or make artworks, or write theory, write papers, or write plays, or write television programs, or whatever you're going to do. So some definitions. Let's go to some definitions. The next slide. Okay. Let's talk about first. We're going to go through each word. We're going to go through indeterminacy. We're going to go through noise, and then we're going to go through the brain without organs. Okay. We're going to define all those. Okay. So first, let's do indeterminacy. The state of not being measured, counted, or clearly known. Describing indeterminacy, composer John Cage said, "My intention is to let things be themselves." Cage initially defined indeterminacy as the ability of a piece to be performed in many substantially different ways. Brian Sims thus conflates indeterminacy with what Cage calls chance composition, when he claims that any part of a musical work is indeterminate if it's chosen by chance, or if its performance is not precisely specified. The former case is called indeterminacy of composition. The latter is called indeterminacy of performance. Next slide, please. Noise, music, or noise. According to Joseph Klett and his co-authors in their article, The Meaning of Indeterminacy, Noise Music, as performance, noise music is characterized by abrasive frequencies and profuse volume. Few disagree that the genre can be harsh, discordant, unlistenable. In aesthetic terms, noise is sound which is chaotic, unfamiliar, offensive, yet such sounds, discard or avoided traditional genres, become the very content of musical form with the phenomena of noise music. We argue that indeterminacy, rather than an obstacle to meaning making, serves as a very symbol of openness, creativity, and community. Noise, music, or noise can be considered a symbolic inversion of traditional music language, being chaotic and inharmonic, according to Barbara Babcock. It consists of excessive levels of distortion, alien timbres, extreme frequency, sudden changes. It is linked to technology from its very beginnings in its recording in 1921 by Luigi Russolo and his brother's noise composition in Tona Rumori, to its present-day production using digital sound-making technologies like sequencers, synthesizers, oscillators, and foot pedals. And Paul Haggerty has argued that it is a failure of meaning as we understand it, that noise is the failure of meaning. Important for us here is noise music relationship to performance, especially as it is encoded by cultural meanings which limit its footplate and sequence of expression, according to the rules and regulations which form the genre and allow specific interpretations. As such, it is composed of a specific assortment of narratological actants operating through the constraints and liberatory possibilities of actor networks, which exercise dynamic influence over perceptual affordances. So what that gobbledygook means, basically, is that in performances, there's a kind of there are these unspecified narratological actants, or this background upon which the performance is being enacted, and that background, you could think of it as, or even as dialectic, a dialectic materialism, a kind of passage from the beginnings of religious performances around a campsite in early man, to acting on a stage in which the history of theater is operating to constrain and to give possibilities, so that the actors are not working in some sort of free-for-all. And it's a lot, that background, those foundations, as they return constantly over and over again, allow for a kind of communication to an audience. Emergent actions result from the indeterminate, but when you talk about noise and how indeterminacy works, it frees itself from all of that. Emergent actions result from the indeterminacy, how objects, settings of human and non-human actors interact in a quasi-amateurish, anti-virtuous environment. So noise in the noise community, amateurish is something that is regarded in a very good way. The idea of the anti-virtuosity is embraced, versus in normal music performance, the idea of the virtuous genius pianist or violinist, the well-trained musician, is something that is considered important. In noise, it's opposite, and it's interesting what that opposition does. It releases from the narratological actants operating through the from these normalizing constraints, creating liberatory possibilities in the actor networks. And this is very important when we talk about distributions of sensibility later on, and distribution of affordances, and how they operate in the socio-political cultural milieu, and how they, through that distribution of sensibility, and then based on certain kinds of neurological theories, which I'm going to, cognitive neuroscientific theories that I'm going to talk to you, there is something like what Bernard Stiegler talks about, exteriorization, or the theory of epiphylogenesis, that this theory now becomes something really that we can get our feet in, that we can get our head around, this idea of how noise is an apparatus in the process of epiphylogenesis. I hope you all know Stiegler's idea. Yeah. If we can talk about that later, if you don't know his theories, I can communicate those to you. So, getting back to this text, this results in both stochastic sonic forms. Stochastic means entropic. Stochastic sonic forms, and also indeterminate performative gestures. And that's what I mean by when I talk about gestalts and affordances operating to create this kind of distribution of sensibility. That when we talk about that, we're going to talk about these ideas of sonic forms, which is the acoustic, the auditory, and the performative, and how they combine into this idea of the distribution of sensibility, and how that sculpts the neuroplasticity of the brain through epiphylogenetic possibilities. Yep. Noise in this context produces information rather than debilitating it. So noise here is a positive thing because it's creating new forms of information. So what is the body without organs? That strange title. It's that strange phrase in the title. It was the French dramatist Antonin Artaud who discovered and named the body without organs. So the brain without organ, I took the idea of the body without organs and created another term, another idea called the body without organs. But I wanted to explain what the body without organs was first, because many of you are probably familiar with the term, and then talk about my own brain without organs concept. So the body is the body. It stands alone. It has no need of organs. The body is never an organism. Organisms are the enemies of the bodies. And that's from Logic and Sense by Gilles Deleuze. Next slide. What is a body without organs? BWO means body without organs. It is a body that is totally unfixed, like a teratoma, or a body of heterodoxy. Heterodoxy at variance with the official doctrine. So a body of heterodoxy. It is a body in which the organization of its organs, from its intimate cellular structure to the relationship with other organs, to its relationship to an entire organism, are free from the despotism of the body's overall plan. In other words, it's free from the rules and regulations of the specific a priori program situated in the DNA code. So what is a teratoma, this word that Deleuze uses? The Guattarian Deleuze used, this unfixed like a teratoma, right? What is a teratoma? The reason I mention that is you really get an idea of what it is. Teratoma is a germ cell. So what happens in the development of the embryo is it goes through a number of stages. You know, the cells divide, and at the 16 cell stage, what's called a blastose coelel or a blastosphere occurs at the 16th stage. And then what happens is there's an invagination. It's like you ever take a tennis ball and push your finger into a tennis ball? It's the same thing. So the blastocoele becomes the gastrula with that when that finger is pressed into this tennis ball. It invaginates and then creates the three layers, the endoderm, the exoderm, and the mesoderm of the embryo, which becomes, for instance, the exoderm becomes the skin and the brain. The mesoderm is the, muscle fibers and things, tendons, muscle fibers, and then the endoderm is the stomach lining and things like that. So it forms these three layers. But when something goes wrong, when this germ cell, this reproducing embryo is released from the dictates of the DNA code, crazy shit happens. And this is an example in which this tumor, which is instead of the different layers of the gastrula being separate and developing their own cell lineages, what happens is they become all mixed up together. So the hair and the muscle and the skin and the blood cells and the brain become all mixed together, and then you get this horrible thing. And then, of course, next slide, please. Deleuze wrote a lot about Francis Bacon, wrote a whole book about him. And of course, here's a kind of another idea. If you want to move in a kind of, open your mind a little bit, possibly you can go from this biological model into this surrealist, expressionist, actionist kind of painting. And from Francis Bacon, 3 Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion, 1962. And then here's another example of this body without organs. The body without organs is just not a body that is inside the skin, but it's a social and political activation. And here we have a number of people who are piercing themselves and attaching strings to each other and creating this sculpture that is in the interstices between them, another body without organs. And then let's go now to cognitive capitalism. And then we're going to bring this whole thing together, the brain without organs and body without organs. We're going to understand it in terms of cognitive capitalism. So here's the 3 books that Christine, I believe, mentioned. These are the latest 3 books of mine called The Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism. And the cognitive capitalism is, in cognitive capitalism, the brain and the mind are the new factories of the 21st century. We no longer labor on assembly lines making objects like automobiles, but rather perform immaterial, effective intellectual labor on such social media websites such as Instagram and Facebook, while all the time creating customized data from our searches on search engines like Google. And that was the big data. This is where all the big data is coming from, and the big other. This, what I talked about before. This transition to what I've referred to as the neural-based economy from the knowledge-based economy has provided capitalism, and now neural capitalism, with new marketplaces and opportunities for commoditization. So what I'm arguing now is this late-stage cognitive capitalism is a neural-based economy. It's moving from this language-based knowledge economy, and in the next few years, next 20 years, we're going to see all things like brain-computer interfaces, optogenetics, cortical implants, new kinds of drugs to make us smarter and stay up all night, and greater attention, not only for people who have what's called attention deficit, but for normal people to increase their attention. So there's this tremendous economy coming up, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with in the next few years. So here is what we all know about it. If you've been to any of the recent biennials, everybody's been making work about precarity, about real subsumption, valorization, financialization of capital, immaterial labor, communicative capitalism. So in precarity is that in early cognitive capitalism, this idea of working for one company your whole life and having medical insurance, we became transient. We're working by ourselves. We're no longer having the umbrella and the safety net that we had in industrial capitalism. We're working all the time. We're carrying our iPads and our tablets and our phones everywhere. We're schmoozing, creating data constantly. That's what real subsumption is. Life has become work. Valorization economies are where it is related to communicative capitalism, in which it's not about value, but it's how many people are valorizing, how many likes you get on Facebook, or how many likes you get on Instagram, how many, and how the corporations and companies are using it for advertising, internet advertising. And that's all about creating valorization. Getting a famous soccer player to say that he wears a specific shoe, sneaker or whatever, so that everybody wants it. That's kind of a valorization. And the thing about valorization is the desire is coming after production. It's not really created by the quality of the object or what the material is made or how careful the object was made. Or how far it had to travel to get to the store where it's being sold. It has really nothing to do with that. It has to do with making it how it operates in the attention economy, and how all the things like public relations and advertising, how they operate after the object comes off the assembly line, and then how they operate on a world of cognitariates. How they work, to captivate the attention of a world of cognitarians. Financialization of capital is about the markets are based on mood, whether things are optimistic or pessimistic. They have nothing to do with the quality of production or how good a company is. It has nothing to do with that. It's about herd behavior. Immaterial labor, all about that. Labor is no longer, making objects and things. It's about performance. But then in late cognitive capitalism, things are changing. I'm not going to get into any of these really, but just to say that neural power replaces biopower. There's something called hedonism, which is about how to increase the efficiencies of neural networks in the brain, which is now important in cognitive labor as opposed to Taylorism, which was important for the proletariat in more traditional laboring environments. The frontal cortex of the brain, the kinds of abilities in the front part of the brain are becoming much more and more important in cognitive capitalism. And as I told you, the commoditization of the neural common by neural capitalism. And the neural common, for me, is all the possibilities of connectivity in the brain, the neuroplasticity. So the body without organs undermined and resisted the tyranny of the assembly line in Fordist factories. And you've all heard all about this because I'm sure you've read Deleuze. By disrupting the body's continuity, with it, as well as the management regulations imposed by Taylorism, thus unsettling the flow of labor in the production of surplus value. The situated body's agency is put in parallel. That's what the body without organs is. And here are some examples of performative definitions or performative examples. And here, of course, is 4 minutes and 30 seconds played by John Tudor, David Tudor, excuse me, of John Cage's composition, where he sits in front of a piano and refuses to work. The idea of the refusal to work is a kind of resistance to the body without organs. Is a kind of body without organs. And here's a piece I would like to play. This first one. Do we have this ready? This next slide on tuning. Do we have that? Yeah. Just play a little about this. So let me say this is at 3 times during the day in Venice. 3 black Steinway pianos were untuned by professional piano tuners, and this is the result. It's about. So what happened in this? Why I'm talking about this in this context is that piano tuners are usually in the behind the scenes. They're not usually performers. They're not creating the work. They're setting up the piano for the virtuoso performer. But in this case, what happens in this noise production, what happens is that the person who is usually in the background now is foregrounded and becomes in this, as we talked about, in this non-professional, amateurish way, through actions that have nothing to do with normal production. There's no score that the person's playing with. It's happening improvisationally through his actions of tuning the piano. The musical composition becomes possible. So let's play a little bit. I'll leave these. We can share the links and people can listen to the whole thing, which is 45 minutes, and it becomes very, very interesting because as you listen to it more and more, it starts making perfect sense. At first, it's really I don't know what kind of the acoustics coming through the internet for me were not very good, but I hope it was better for you. But if you listen to it, you'll see that it's really amazing what your brain does. Okay, let's skip the throbbing gristle psychic sacrifice. Again, you can find that on the internet. And let's go to how different. Let's go back to the slide of the backwards to the slide of the assembly line. Can you do that for me? Back to that one. Yeah, you can see how different is laboring today. The image on your right or the image on your left, especially the image on your right, as each that this kind of abstract labor, this labor that's been so abstracted that the whole production line has been segmented into small movements, small activities that as the car moves down the assembly line, the whole car is constructed as a series of abstract small movements that are highly regulated. And what happens with that abstract labor is that anybody, it's so simplified, it's so abstract that if someone's sick and somebody else needs to do the job of another person, it's not that hard. When you look here, how different it is for the cognitariat now, each on a different, one person's using the remote control to watch the digital TV, the other person's on a laptop, the other one's on an iPad, and the other person is on an iPhone. Each doing, and the labor that they're doing, not only are they not using their bodies at all, they're almost still, they're holding these devices in their hand, they may be typing, but it's more about different ideas of work and labor. The labor is going on inside their head. They're thinking, they're creating data, they're enjoying. But it's a very different kind of labor. It's a cognitive labor. In cognitive capitalism, the body without organs, you see, the body without organs is not going to be effective as a kind of dissensus here. In cognitive capitalism, the body without organs is no longer an adequate disruptor of the laboring styles, and thus a new form of dissensus is required. Remember, we are all cognitariats or digital laborers in which life itself is work. In the future, new forms of technology, like the wired brain that we've been talking about all this whole lecture, in which brain-computer interfaces will hook up to the brain's electrical activity to the internet and virtual reality, will further complicate this situation. It will be the unconscious and conscious thoughts of the digital labor that will greatly generate the data used by big data and the big other. Real subsumption will be dominated by neural subsumption. Everything that we think, conscious and unconscious, will be labor. Just as the body without organs derailed fixed capital and the surplus production of formless assembly line, I am suggesting that the brain without organs will deregulate different forms of existing and future fixed labor. Now the intracranial, extracranial brain. So the fixed labor of the assembly line, the heavy machinery of the assembly line, the steel, and all of this fixed capital is going to be switched out for the intracranial and extracranial brain, meaning the neurons, the synapses, the axons, the networks, what are called cognates, which are combinations of neurons. And the key here is that, and I will show you in the next slides coming up, is that the brain is not just in the head. The brain is situated. I'll explain what situated means, and it's also extracranial. It has to do with the social, political, and economic relations. And the fact of the matter is that the brain without organs is working on this whole brain, the intracranial, extracranial, and situated brain. It's acting in all of those parts. The brain without organs is such a form of deregulation and disturbance. I want to speak about the brain without organs, an entity that is indeterminate and malleable. The brain without organs is an indeterminate organ, and neuroplasticity is its agency. One could also say that our neuroplastic potential is a form of the common, currently under assault by neoliberals' politics and its apparatuses, private and corporate ownership. This relation of the indeterminate and how it transforms the material brain will form the core of this lecture. I want to understand that this power of artistic production, I want to understand this as the power of artistic production. To do this, we will need to take advantage of a multidisciplinary, intersectional, and activist approach. So what does brain mean in the term brain without organs? I want to suggest an indeterminate conceptual framework for the brain, one that is not planned. I want to use aleatory music and chants to make my point. The brain is not a crystallized structure, but a fluid and becoming entity. So this is the expanded view. First, what does brain mean? So here's, by brain, I'm meaning the extended, embodied, emerging one, which is coupled to an evolving sociocultural, technological environment in which mindedness is its agency. I want to suggest intracranial, extracranial situated complex. So here in my little funny little cartoon, we have a man or a woman, a human being on the left side, and that person has a brain. That's the intracranial brain, inside the cranium, inside the skull. Now, positive neuroscientists and positive neuroaestheticians understand that everything is coming from the brain, that there is no situated body, that there is no external extracranial brain. It's everything is a phenomenon, is a figment of the brain. And the way that you understand art is through using different kinds of MRI machines and things like that to see what the reaction of the brain is to art. But then I always say to these positivist neuroaestheticians, well, what happens if you have a grid painted on a painted surface in a Russian constructivist painting, and then you have the same grid painted on another painting that comes out of pattern painting of the 1970s? They're both grids. Now, if you put those paintings and ask whether it's a monkey or human being to look at that grid, the same cells in the visual cortex will be stimulated and will be activated. And the same parts of the brain, whether it's the temporal lobe or the parietal lobe or even the frontal eye fields, there will be a reaction. However, we all know that the difference between Russian constructivism and pattern, that grid means a completely different thing. The grid in the Russian constructivist painting has nothing to do with the grid in the pattern painting, or maybe it does somewhat because it became a language of aesthetic painting practice. But besides that, it's the territory or the mapping of that grid within the socio-political historical realm of which Russian constructivism coming out of the Russian Revolution and experiencing that, and pattern painting coming out of a very different kind of abstract painting coming out of American quilts and feminist practice is a very different. So that being said, the grid is also very, very different. And that's really basically the difference between the positivist and the activist neuroaesthetic position. But again, I just wanted to throw that out there. But here we have the brain inside the skull, and then we have this idea of the situated body. Now, what is the situated body? Well, the situated body is that the eyes of human beings only see between 400 and 700 nanometers. That's what they call the color spectrum. Other entities, other organisms and other animals and insects, they can see different kinds of wavelengths, ultraviolet radiation, and other things like that. But also that there is this thing called the transbiome or microsome, which is that the brain also is in the stomach, and there's a series of organisms that create this kind of brain, another kind of brain that can actually affect through the production of different kinds of chemicals called kinins that circulate through the body, can actually cause depression in the brain or depression. And then, of course, we have all of this accelerated technologies that we all have been talking about in post-humanism and post-operaismo and post-anthropocentric, and how these kind of feminist practices and how they are reconfiguring and decentering and estranging the cultural milieu, and how that all becomes an important in the way that the brain is going to be sculpted. I want to speak about the brain without organs, and go back one more slide. Sorry, go back to the slide. So I want to also mention that at every one of these points on this intracranial, extracranial situated complex, the brain without organs is operating. Okay, next slide. So I want to speak about the brain without organs, an entity that is indeterminate and malleable. And this is where we're bringing in noise and indetermination into our ideas of neuroscience and how we understand neuroplasticity. The brain without organs is in a constant state of becoming, and its power is the brain's pluripotentiality. The famous neuroscientist Olaf Sporns puts it, the indeterminacy of the information content of the world of objects and events is matched by the structural variability of the animal nervous system at many levels of organization. This variation occurs at many levels in the nervous system, including the number of synapses, their forms, the number of neurons, patterns of neurochemical distribution, the sequence of events at the growing tip of the growth cones, and the consequent variation of structure due to learning. So here we have that the structural variability matches the variability of worlds of objects and events. We're going to come back to that. Essential here is to understand where in other systems, variation can represent noise, which degrades performance. And here we go back to this idea of noise as something that's creating information we talked about before. Variation can represent noise which degrades performance. The opposite is true in selectional and constructivist systems in the brain, which propose that the brain's variable population of neural elements with variable characteristics and tuning personality allows for a differential response to an unknown environment. I'm going to explain this perfectly to you. You're going to understand this perfectly, but I'm just pushing this out here in the middle of my talk before I get to the meat and potatoes, just to give you some very familiarity with some of the language. But we're going to go through this, so don't worry if you don't understand what the hell I'm talking about right now. But we just remember that there's a variable population in the brain, this variation, and there's this variation that's constant in this becoming world that art, architecture, film, writing, all kinds of different kinds of artistic production is creating this kind of becoming variation in the extracranial brain or in the socio-political, economic, and cultural milieu. In a variable population of neurons with variable characteristics, there occur differential amplification of those elements most in sync with the environmental contingency, cell death, apoptosis for those elements which are not. So certain of these neurons in the brain, the currency of the brain is not money, it's energy, it's a stimulation. So those neurons that are in the developing brain, and we'll see this in a second, that are most stimulated, they become most efficient, and they are selected for over those neurons that don't have any, are not getting stimulated, and they die off. So I just in final, before I get into this whole thing, what I'm talking about, what produces this indeterminacy in the world that he speaks of, I want to focus on artistic practices that engage with indeterminacy as a doorway of art power in general. I want to link the implications of Sporn's quote by understanding the immaterial and material consequences of works of experimental art and the avant-garde in the architecture of the brain and world. So let's step back for a moment and review some basic concepts in the fields of art and neurobiology to understand the magnitude and the profundity of these statements. Let's talk about the deterioration of the material brain. As Gilles Deleuze writes in Cinema 2, the time image, creating new circuits in art means creating new circuits in the brain. And here is a neuron. I just wanted to show you what we're talking. I just want to give you a little bit of anatomy here. Don't be worried if you didn't pass biology in high school. Don't worry, it's no big deal. But here is the unit called the neuron, which is the very basic unit of the brain, like the muscle cell is the basic unit of the muscle, or so forth and so on. The neuron has a number of parts, and the important part is if you look at the very top of this diagram, you have the dendrites, which are these appendages that are coming off what's called the cell body or the soma, and inside the soma is this red dot, which is the nucleus. The nucleus is where the DNA is where the DNA on the chromosomes are. And the DNA splits, and the mRNA, the messenger RNA, there you go, messenger RNA again, copies it and then flows out. And then in the soma, you see these little pink dots. Those are the ribosomes. Those are for no better idea, those are the assembly lines where proteins are created. The messenger RNA is a kind of messenger. It's called a messenger RNA because it's a messenger that directs the ribosomes to know what kind of proteins are made. And the proteins are neurochemicals. You've heard of serotonin. You've heard of glutamate. You've heard of acetylcholine. You've heard of dopamine. You've heard all those are those neurochemicals are basically proteins that are produced by the ribosomes, and they flow down this kind of this appendage. They flow down through a series of microtubules. They flow down to the very end to where they're captured in spherules, little barrels, like how you would put where you would when you make wine in a barrel. You hold the wine in the barrel, you let it ferment, do all those kinds of things, and then when you want to drink it, you drink it. Well, the same thing happens kind of here, and here is, I want to go, let's go to four slides down. I'm going to a little ahead myself. There, you passed it. There you go. And so here are those synaptic vesicles that we said were those proteins that are captured in synaptic vesicles, and move down and look at the top of the slide. You see these these protein structures, the fibrils that transport the spherules down to this area called the presynaptic membrane. This is the synapse. So what happens is these spherules are created in the soma, where they travel down the axon, and they're released into this synaptic space. Synapse means space, very small space, but it's released here. And when it's released, there are the red ones are one chemical, the green ones another chemical. They interact with the postsynaptic membrane, where there are little gates which allow the material, these various chemicals, neurochemicals, to be released, and they operate on the postsynaptic membrane. And what do they do? Go back 2 slides. Let's go back 2 slides. Sorry about that. Go the other way, the other direction. The other direction, please. There you go. No, yeah, one more, the other way. You're going the wrong, yeah, one more. Back, one more, yeah. So here are 2 neurons, and they're connected to each other. And then you see that the axon of the previous neuron is connecting through a synapse with what are called the dendrites, which are those appendages I mentioned. There's the nucleus, there's everything I talked about. Now, when there's enough positive and negative charges, and the positivity, these synapses can be negative, they can be inhibitory, or they can be positive, they can be excitatory. And when the excitatory outdistances the inhibitory, an electrical discharge is created, which goes down the axon, which is the sausage-shaped appendage, and stimulates another neuron. And if the amount of input is enough, a depolarization is occurring. Let's go to the next slide now. And here's all the negative and positive inputs. You see the different ones that have a positive, and some of them have a negative. And when there's enough positive, you get what's called an excitatory postsynaptic potential. That's on the right above the action potential. There's an EPSP and an IPSP. So you get an EPSP or an IPSP depending on how many different inhibitory, excitatory. Now, why is that important? You're going to love me for this in a minute. Just hold there with me. So this is how memory is caused. And I'm going to go to the next, let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's go to this slide. Okay, that's like 3 slides down. 3 slides down, right. Okay, one more. Okay, so here we have, this is why we've been learning all this anatomy, why I've been, having to show you this. So believe it or not, this is a picture on the left of a 17-day-old cat, their visual cortex. And on the right, I have an adult cat. And this is what neuroplasticity is. This is how this is the whole basis of this idea of what I'm saying is epiphylogenesis in a Stiglerian way. What happens is you have a 17-day-old cat, and at a certain time, 17 days, a overwhelming production of axons take place. So in the DNA directs the cells of this part of the brain, which is called the visual cortex, which is in the back. If you touch the back of your head, right underneath there is called the visual cortex, and that is what the brain uses to see. And all over the brain, if you just like you have a skull that covers the brain, right underneath the skull is called the cortex. And the cortex changes everywhere in the brain. It covers the whole brain. And it's always 6 layers. And if you look on this diagram, you can see in Roman numerals 1 through 6. 1 being the most outside, and 6 being the, no, 1 being the most outside, yeah, and 6 being the most interior. And what we're seeing here and is those neurons I just showed you, yeah? I just showed you those neurons. And here we have, they're all clumped up. They have no sense. There's no order. They're anarchic. They're just a clump because the DNA of the cat has ordered this overall production, but there's no sense to it. It's a noisy production. It's a pluripotential production. All of this is about possibility. It's not about reality. It's not about any structure. It's all the possible, all what could be possible. Then what happens is that cat goes outside. Can we back up one slide now? Let's back up one slide. Okay, thank you. And that cat has what's called an Umwelt, which means an environment. That cat has a visual Umwelt. Those visual aspects of the cat environment that cat needs to survive most effectively. You know, meeting a mate, you know, in the catching a mouse, using aggressive behavior, social behavior, you know, thinking about how to capture that bird. All of these knowing what kind of species a bird it wants to be a predator for. You know, what kind of cat is, you know, does it want to be its mate? All of this is different kinds of visual information, which is the conspecific Umwelt, visual Umwelt for the cat. Now, if we go back to the slide, we go back forward now, and we see this drawing. Here we have the cat Umwelt, and that cat Umwelt is sculpting this neuroplastic, very anarchic mess of disordered neural appendages. And so the adult cat, as a result of interacting with that Umwelt, those neurons that share specificities, that share activity, that are activated and stimulated by certain events in the environment, which occur over and over and over again, they become more efficient and they survive. And it's based on a similar process called Darwinism. They survive and they go on to live and be alive. Whereas those that weren't stimulated in this way and were outcompeted for this neural space, they die off. That's called apoptosis. And what happens as a result of this Umwelt is that you have a very organized, all of a sudden, very sculpted, discrete anatomy here that is specific for the needs of that cat. Now, what also happens is that another phenomena occurs, that all of a sudden there is now a group of neurons that are alive and have been stimulated and are efficient and have been selected for, and that represents certain capacities and components of the cat environment that are now living together in the fourth layer of the brain. And there are certain emerging phenomena that occur, certain kinds of a social brain. So on one hand, you have a Darwinistic neoliberal brain model, and the other you have this kind of social brain, where because of their proximity to each other, because they share certain kinds of stimulation, because they're part of a network that any part of the network can also stimulate them, they become more than the sum of their parts. And so that is how neuroplasticity is working. Next slide. And here we have a similar thing, and this is called synaptic pruning. So you see that if you follow this synaptic formation, all of a sudden at 2 years, you see this incredibly intense and very dense, all the layers are very, very dense, incredibly dense tissue. And then at 4 years and 6 years, you see that through synaptic pruning, that the unimportant or non-usable or unsignificant neurons are die off, and those that are significant, they form allegiances and develop relationships to the network. Next slide, please. And the same thing happens when you all hear about artificial neural networks and artificial intelligence. The same method, an artificial neural network is based on the neural network. So if we go back one more, let's go back again. One more. So here we had this pruning of the real neural network, and that same let's go back up 2 now, 2 more, let's go 2. And we go forward 2, please, go forward 2. Yeah, right there. And the same, when you hear about artificial neural networks and them pruning and learning and how do artificial neural networks learn and all of this, here we have how it works. So at first, the artificial neural is very dense, and that every one of the cell bodies or the electrical bodies are connected to each other. So if you look at each one of these blue circles, they're connected to each other maximally, yeah? They're all maximally connected at each layer. So you go from layer 1 to layer 2 to layer 3 to layer 4. And you now, when they prune, it for a specific task through elaborate pattern learning and elaborate rehearsal, they undergo change. And that's called pruning. And this is what's happening in artificial neural networks too. And so here is an example I thought would be a good example. Here you have the 17-day, you have topiary, which is the sculpting of, the art of sculpting plant material, and certain hedges are used. And on the left, you have what would be called the 17-day-old kitten, and on the right, you have the adult kitten, and you have this kind of sculpting of this very amorphous form of this bush that hasn't been treated, and then all of a sudden it becomes this spiraling entity. So that's a kind of a way of looking at it. And then here's a recent this is a sculpture. This is not the sculpture, but this is a, next slide. Yeah, thank you. This is a work I'm making in Berlin. It opens May 1st. It's called The Parthenon Marbles Revisited. And it's based on the idea of an artificial neural network. And in this case, what is the input layer? An artificial neural network is, I didn't go into this because it's just so much to go into, but an artificial neural network is made of an input layer, a hidden layer, and an output layer. And the input layer in this case is, the input layer is the Parthenon marbles, this incredible classic sculpture that forms much of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And then also what's happening is you notice that each one of the arms on this or legs in this case over here of the sculpture have been broken. And to me, I'm always amazed by their imperfection. And in this case, what I'm doing here is I'm drawing on them in this model that I'm making, which is a neon sculpture that's active. I'm drawing phantom limbs. And the phantoms are here, the telescoping foot of the phantom limb. This is the phantom hand, phantom shoulder that's been remapped on the face, phantom hand, again and again. And then as you notice that in the hidden layer, the information from the Parthenon marbles of ancient Greek classicism is now mixing with the input together, forming the hidden layer of the phantom. And the phantom is representing the other, it's representing the alterity, it's representing the global mind versus the Eurocentric mind. It's not representing the only patriarchy. It's representing fluid gender dynamics. It's representing, that's what the phantom is. The phantom or the specter the unknowable, is this other, which now has a voice. And if we want to create this new kind of enlightenment for the singularity in the future, we have to adopt, what I'm arguing in this sculpture is we have to argue, we have to create a much more expansive idea of the Enlightenment. And then inside the hidden layer is all about the story of the Parthenon marbles, which are now located in London in the Elgin Room of the Brooklyn Museum. And there's all this kind of expatriation and reparations, all kinds of discussions after Brexit of all these kinds of very complicated cultural situations that are being attended to and are controversial. And and these are what's dictating the concept. What are the different formations that are inside the hidden layer, which are then creating the AIs. And you also know that in the middle of this is noise, strangely enough, and de-optimization events. And these are part of this distribution of these neural networks. And it goes on, and I could speak a whole lecture on this. Of course, I have all of the emojis, this idea of the affective economy. As I mentioned before, the valorization economy, likes and dislikes, and they're operating at each one of these synapses to create different kinds of neural efficiencies that affect, how that pruning, which we saw in the image I showed you of the artificial neural network, the pruning, how the pruning will occur over time. And I built, and I'll have in the show, I have this film, I should have, of course, brought it here today to you, and I'm sorry, but I can send it to you, and you can see this, virtual reality film that I made based on this. Okay, next slide. So the development of brain networks does not involve brain processes alone. Neural mechanisms for learning and plasticity allow for the developing brain to extract statistical regularities occurring in the environment. This is the whole epiphylogenesis I was talking about. This is the entangled brain model. This is the intracranial, extracranial situated brain. These uniformities can be partly the result of sensory motor actions between the learning organism and the surrounding physical and social world. Today, these uniformities and effects are predominantly structured not by nature, but by sovereign culture, designing the urban and virtual spaces and temporalities. As Manuel Delanda says above, homogeneous states are highly unlikely states that are the result of intense pressures that sculpt, in this case, first the environment and then the neuroplastic potential. Next slide, please. So imagine here's a child working on the internet. So this is what's sculpting the neuroplasticity right now. The human umwelt is very different than the cat umwelt. The cat umwelt is really not changing. From one generation of cats to another, the world is pretty much for the cat, not that much different. Or for the elephant, that is. The elephant is born with an extended phenotype. So the elephant, what a phenotype is, what the elephant looks like. It has a big trunk. It has a certain kind of hoof that allows it to deal with its weight and allows it to move. It has a certain size, and it's embedded in an environment which it's born into. Very right from the start, an elephant baby can walk, but it can also already start interacting with its umwelt. And that umwelt, the trees that it eats or whatever, is extended in its extended phenotype. Just as what the elephant looks like, the phenotype could be described also by the food that the elephant is eating, the places where they rest, the kinds of behavior that they manifest in certain kinds of social relations. That could be, that's directly related to its phenotype. That it has tusks, that it has certain kinds of teeth to gnaw certain kinds of trees, a certain kind of trunk that can reach certain branches. That's all part of the phenotype. But it's called an extended phenotype because it's extended into the environment. In human beings, we can change that extended phenotype. We don't have something that's static or crystallized. Our extended phenotype is constantly changing. And the neuroplasticity is what's allowing us to take advantage of that. But that's having, if you think of Stiegler and you think about this idea of the relationship between the phenotype and the extended phenotype and how cultural objects operate within the extended phenotype, you understand that in the last 2 million years, from the beginning of Homo habilis to Homo erectus and Homo sapien, you realize that certain kinds of events, cultural and technological events like the beginning of fire or the mass migrations and population explosions that led to the migrations out of Africa, or the beginning of different kinds of spear production and the idea of the bifaced spear and the technologies that were required to create, to make the flint that was sharp. Then the ideas of using these tools, these spears, to now use it in social behaviors. And then, of course, the burying of the dead, the rituals and religious experiences around the burying the dead, and the kinds of jewelry and ornaments that they wore, that they dressed their dead in. All of these cultural, sociological, and political, if you will, events in the last 2 million years, these critical events had critical reactions in the brain, and the brain changed at each one of these moments of cultural crises. Different kinds of neural adaptations caused by waves of epiphylogenesis sculpted the neuroplastic elements of the brain over time. When these things were recurring generation over generation, you have, for instance, the brain, the forebrain, the frontal cortex getting larger. You have the parietal cortex, which is kind of in the middle of your brain, expanding outward. You have the temporal cortex, which much of the language areas of the brain, it expands. So there's this relationship between these cultural, socio-political phenomena and moments of crisis and the development of brain. Today, we have technology. We have 3 and 4-year-olds already on the internet. And this is from Andy Clark. Imagine that you begin using the web at age 4. Dedicated software agents track and adapt to your emerging interests and random explorations. This is big data. They then help you direct your attention to new ideas, web pages, and products. Over the next 70 years, you and your software agents are locked in a complex dance of co-evolutionary change and learning, each influencing and being influenced by the other. In such case, in very real sense, the software entities look less like part of your problem-solving environment than part of you. The intelligence system that now confronts the wider world is biological you plus the software agents. These external bundles of code are contributing rather like the various subpersonal cognitive functions activating your brain. Rancière proposes that our sensible environments are designed to create homogeneous experiences that organize and police our free will. The distribution of the sensible, which includes auditory stimulation as well as better known visual stimulation, determine who has the power of doing, ways of seeing and listening, which determine who has the power to name the sayable, the thinkable, and the possible. As we have witnessed above, these networks of distributions have implications for the extended material brain. So these networks, that exist in the real, imaginary, and virtual world create network configurations and relations in the brain. I want to also suggest that is the distribution of affordances that organize the possibilities of performative action. So it's not just Gestalt, it's affordances. So for those of you who don't know the difference between a Gestalt and an affordance. So if a teacup, if you had a teacup, if you had 2 teacups on a table and you were sitting and your eye was at the same level as the edge of the table, and you were looking at the two teacups, and one teacup was in front of another, there were certain relations of those objects that affect your sensorial predisposition and understanding of that situation. So one cup is blocking the other cup, but because of experience, you know that the other cup is behind that cup. So in your brain, you could even imagine both cups. That's the Gestalt. Affordances is that on the teacup, there's a little protrusion that is for your finger. The affordance is the fact that you, as you move towards the cup to grasp the cup, to hold the teacup, you're already using your index finger in your brain. You're already directing your index finger to move into the little hole that is that little handle that's on that teacup. That's the affordance. It's the fact that you already know it's a motor response. It's not sensory, it's motor. It's how your motor, how your activity, how you're going to grab that cup. And there could be also a beautiful cup that has the in the body of the cup, there might not even be a handle, but it might be a place for your hand to, ergonomically, the whole idea of ergonomics, for instance, is about this interaction of gestalts and affordances. And as we have witnessed from the above, these networks of distributions have implications for the extended brain and the affordances. I want to also suggest that there's a distribution of affordances that organize the possibilities of performative action. Noise and indeterminacy act on the very root of these distributions, and with the artist's hand, redistribute and estrange this sensibility. Remembering what we learned above, this has consequences for how the architecture of the brain is formatted. Next slide, please. So here we have Corbusier, Radiant City, and how different is that than this Vertov Kino Eye, or man with a camera, from still from the camera. How different is that? And how different is that kind of movement between the Corbusier and Vertov to the Naked City by Guy Debord? What kind of experience, what kind of relationship to the city, this torn city, this situationist city? How different is the sensibility? How different is the distributions of sensibility? And of course, Debord was always talking about psychogeography. Don't take this normal street, don't go the normal way, don't follow the normal path, go into an empty vacant lot and walk through that. This is this idea of chance, indeterminacy, that is a very important part of the idea of the naked city. And I think time is getting, it's not necessary. Again, we'll send you all these, you can see them later. But then what this does is that at the micro level, the micro synaptic level, there are macro changes as well at the gross level. So here we have the seven different people. These on the top of the page, you're seeing a MEG scans, which is a type of EEG, on 7 different individuals, all doing the same exact thing. Every one of them is doing the same activity. And yet, if you can imagine, if you look at the relationship with the black and the white on each one of these skulls, or whatever images of the head, you see that how the white and the black looks is completely different. So at birth, each of us have highly variable nervous systems that are sculpted in very, very different ways that lead to very different kinds of neural architectures. We are a population of singularities, we are not, as Rancière would, as the nightmare of Rancière's ideas would mean, we are not a homogeneous people. We are a multiplicity of singularities. And what makes us a multiplicity of singularities is this variation of the neuroplastic architecture. The ontogenies of the models of the brain from the modular to the network. So here we have the history of how the brain was envisioned. And when we look at the way the philosophy and the science of the brain, we understand how all of these systems are interrelated. So here we have this idea of the 19th century phrenology, that each part of the skull, or the top of the brain, the bumps on the skull related to a specific different kinds of personality. And then on the right, you have the early what's called modular ideas of the brain, that there were different areas of the brain that had very specific capacities. I mentioned the visual cortex before, the parietal cortex, the frontal cortex, the cerebellum, all these different organs of the brain. And these are like medium specificity. So these concepts are coming out of modernism. So that even brain neurophysiology and neuroanatomy is not something that is isolated. It's part of a whole series of interdisciplinary networks. So the insistence of medium specificity arose in the era of modernism and has become associated with the art critic Clement Greenberg. The concept, however, can be traced back to Gotthold Ephraim Lessing in 1766 essay The Laocoon. Lessing dismantles Horace's famous claim, ut pictura poesis, as is painting, so is poetry, arguing that these media are inherently different, because while poetry unfolds in time, painting exists in space. He refers to the media as two equitable and friendly neighbors who should not overstep their respective terrains. Lessing contends that an artwork, in order to be successful, needs to adhere to the specific stylistic properties of its own medium. And here we have this kind of medium specificity of the brain, that each part of the brain does a specific thing, and that they're friendly neighbors. But of course, next slide, tracing ideas, Deleuze's idea of the body without organ and superposing it upon the notion of the brain, one could say the fact that the brain without organs does not lack modules, hubs, and verifiable cognates. It simply lacks the organism, that is, a particular organization of the organs. The brain without organs is an indeterminate organ, and neuroplasty is its agency. One could also say that our neuroplastic potential is a form of the common currently under assault. I already mentioned that. So here we have very interesting phenomena. So here we have the world map of the 24-hour relative utilization of the internet. And you can see, it's moving around and it's getting dark and bright and everything. And then here on the bottom, we have this idea of the network brain. It's no longer a modular brain. So in our postmodern world, in which, like Rauschenberg, his combines using sculpture and painting, or Warhol using photography and photo skill screen to paint on canvases, and all of this different kind of hybridity, this kind of interactive media installation art, all of this stuff coming where the medium specificity gave way to a postmodern idea. Here we see the same thing happening in the brain. The brain is now a network phenomena which is categorized not by a modular system of only visual cortex or whatever, or auditory cortex or whatever area for language or whatever, but it's about node strength and core membership and node centrality, so that each activity stimulates the whole brain, but to a lesser or greater extent depending on what it is that it's doing. Next slide, please. Either way, the development of brain networks does not involve brain processes alone. Neural mechanisms for learning and plasticity allow the developing brain to extract emerging statistical regularities presented in the environment. That's what we saw in that 17-day-old cat. It extracted statistical regularities for itself. I want to suggest that aleatory and chance experiments in aesthetic cultural field alter these distributions of sensibility and thus present altered statistical regularities that organize the neural architecture differently. Next slide. Artistic examples of aleatory and chance artworks. So for the first example of these, I wanted to talk about Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages. To make 3 standard stoppages, Marcel Duchamp dropped 3 1-meter-long threads from the height of 1 meter onto 3 canvases. The threads were then adhered to the canvases, preserving the random curves they had assumed upon landing. Cut along the profiles of each falling thread, the canvases served as templates for 3 draftsman straight edges, wood tools that retain the length of the meter but paradoxically standardize the accidental curve. The accidental curve becomes standardized. So there you have the idea of this kind of warping and reconfiguring of the distributions of sensibility. Now we have instruments that are going to be used to make buildings and to make drawings and things like that based on accidental curves. Duchamp's deliberate useless toolkit. Was it useless? I don't know. You subvert standardized units of measure while simultaneously poking fun at the scientific method. That's what I was talking about before when I mentioned that my own relationship is similar to Duchamp's, and this idea of pataphysics plays an important role. Though he glibly referred to 3 standard stoppages as a joke about the meter, his description of its outcome reads like a mathematical theorem. If a straight horizontal thread 1 meter long falls from a height of 1 meter onto a horizontal plane, twisting it as it pleases, it creates a new image of the unit of length. And here is the artwork, 3 standard stoppages. And Duchamp was not the only experimenter with chance. Art composed collages by picking up chance scraps of paper, shuffling them and gluing them down just as they fell. Example, the squares arranged according to laws of chance, 1960. According to Hans Richter, he finally tore it up and let the pieces flutter to the floor of his studio. Sometime later, he happened to notice those same scraps of paper as they lay on the floor and was struck by the pattern they formed. It had all the expressive power that he had tried in vain to achieve. And here is his artwork. And then Niki Saint-Saval, Shooting Picture is one of the series of works by Saint-Saval titled TIRS, tir, meaning fire or gunshot in French, which were made up until 1970 and all involved the artist shooting at a canvas. These shootings were conceived as performances and as such formed part of the work. At some shootings, audiences members were invited to participate, and in the case of this painting owned by the Tate, Jasper Johnson and Robert Rauschenberg took aim. And here's the painting by Niki Saint-Saval. Aleatory music, or chance music, is a music in which some element of the composition is left to chance, and some primary element of composed works realization is left to the determination of its performers. The term is most often associated with procedures in which chance element involves a relatively limited number of possibilities. Excuse me, I have to take some water. Some writers do not make a distinction between aleatory, chance, and indeterminacy in music and use the term interchangeably. From this point of view, indeterminate or chance music can be divided into 3 groups. The use of random procedures to produce a determinate fixed score, mobile form, indeterminate notation, including graphic notation and text. And here we have the famous piece, Drip Music, by Brecht. Most performed pieces have been included in numerous Fluxus and Fluxus-inspired events. The indeterminate score allows for a strong degree of freedom in performance, though most interpretations of the piece involve the performer dripping water from one vessel into another. In 1963, performance of Drip Music at Fluxus Forum Fluxus in Dusseldorf, George Mussenius performed this action from the top of a ladder, as above we saw before. And I was going to play this, and that was it. If you want to play it, if we can play it, we can play it. Can we play the last slide? Yeah, can we play that? This is called Conversations with Noise. All right, let me stop for 1 second. So what happened here is I broke up in this whole series of work, I would break up speakers and I would break them up with the tools that were in the studio. So very different than Robert Morse's making of a box. It's kind of, he was making something, I was breaking something. So are you in the same genre? I broke up the different speakers, and as I broke up the speakers, I would record it. Now, in some cases, I left the broken pieces and put it on a scaffold, on a plinth, and in others, I reconstructed the speaker, and and actually played the speaker. But now we can see it. And then I had invited improvisational musicians to come and have a conversation with noise. Could it be possible to have a conversation with noise? Because noise doesn't have the repeatability that music does, as we learned in this lecture. So anyway, here we go. You can play it now. she has her foot on a pedal, and when she puts her foot on the pedal, it activates the broken sculpture, and then she's responding to it. And here's one of the speakers reconstructed, and now the musician is pressing on a pedal and, creating that sound. And she's playing. Okay, that's fine. Okay, any questions? It was a little long, sorry. How are we doing? Hello?
Wait a second, please.
Okay, sure.
So, okay, so probably you can hear me now, I guess.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, can you imagine this? This lost the battery. So yeah, it was maybe too long. No, it was super interesting, Warren. Thank you so much. As you said, you would do a work of art, and I think we had exactly that. So thank you so much. And I think there will be questions. So I'm sure I want to ask you one, and I'm sure Diogo also wants to ask. We're going to have to keep it short, though, because we're about to enter the second hour, and so we have to stop in about 10 minutes. So we're going to do it fast. And I think I'm going to start by asking Diogo. Do you want to ask your question, and then I'll leave mine? Okay, so I think he's not ready. I'm going to ask my question. So I was listening to you, and all this interest of plasticity is something that resonates a lot. And so I was thinking while you were explaining it that, of course, you start with a noisy brain, and then you start to organize it by your experiences. So on one hand, you gain experience and memories. On the other hand, you start to lose possibilities as soon as you start interacting with your environment. And the way you lose those possibilities, and that was the part that saddened me, is that we do have a capitalist brain, because the neurons that are not efficient, or the paths that are not efficient, the neurons die. So that was something that was not easy for me to see, because maybe, could it be that since we are reading the brain with our brains and our experiences, is it that way that plasticity is lost, is by losing the non-efficient? How can we keep experiences in a way that the non-efficient are also important? Did I make sense?
Well, that is, that I think you've asked the key question. I mean, that is a fantastic question, and I'd like to thank you for it, because it helps me, it allows me to see what part of the lecture that I can now go back to and explain. So first of all, you're absolutely right that we do lose our plasticity. It's not that, and I could have shown more slides and all that to show you that, in fact, there are two moments in which the plasticity is the highest. That is between the ages of like 3 and 5, and then again at 13 and 15. And in the age range of 2 to 5, the plasticity is greater in the back of the brain, where all the sensory, as I mentioned, the auditory cortex, somatosensory cortex, visual cortex, and so forth and so on. And then the front part of the brain is where all the plasticity is, where your personality is being developed, your attention, all that kind of stuff in the frontal cortex is happening later. It so happens that the teenager is the one that's being most affected, by these new technologies, which are affecting his, attention deficit and all these other kinds of things. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, what I was trying to say. But on the other hand, yes, as we get older, we do lose a certain degree of plasticity, although we do have plasticity throughout our life. It's just not you don't have that incredible spike that, like I showed you, at 17-day-old cat. The same thing happens in a human being, but we don't have that later. The other thing about it is that we have much less. We have much less. Now, the other thing about it that I want to point out is, when I was showing you that cat brain, I mentioned to you that there are two aspects. There's the first kind of neoliberal Darwinian survival of the fittest brain, but then when those when those neurons that have survived and that are contoured or sculpted by the specific Umwelt of the cat, or the human, the same analogy would be for the human. As technology, the brain is being sculpted by technology. That's why I showed you that baby on the computer. What happens is those remaining neurons, they create a kind of social brain where they form networks with each other and start having new possibilities. So the second part of that phase is the phase of the emergent phenomena of those remaining neural cells that are in the various, within limits, of course, everything's within limits, that are together, that have survived that apoptotic moment, and have survived and gone on and formed new kinds of relationships and new kinds of networks, and form the social brain and different kinds of cohesiveness. So there's both happening. So I just wanted to explain that a little bit to round out the story. And then the other part of your question, I think, is also about the power of art, and the power that the thing about neuroplasticity is it can have a negative or positive effect. On one hand, it can be negative in the sense that governments know about neuroplasticity now, and they are, there are different kinds of governments and different kinds of power relations that are trying to use these policing methods, whether it's in the environment, which we saw through Rancière, or what I'm call the phenomenology of the sculpting, or in the world that we are facing with brain-computer interfaces, where this what I call the synthetic connectome could potentially be the sculptor of the brain. That we are already seeing that internet and the World Wide Web in that little child, and the algorithms that the child is now in connection with is acting already as a supplementary brain. But if we move forward out of those technologies into the new technologies of brain-computer interfaces connected to the internet and virtual reality, we understand that there could be a direct sculpting, that there could be a real sculpting of the neuroplasticity by this alternative brain, so that there are negative implications for neuroplasticity. On the other hand, there is the emancipatory capacity of the neuroplasticity. If we are only strong enough and have the willpower to take hold of it, that the possibility for neural diverse, the embracing of the neural diverse, for instance, or the production of the multiplicity rather than the singular people, rather than the unitary people, we create a multitude of singularities with very, very different brains, like I showed you in that slide where all the brains were doing different things. If we accentuate that, if we create where we create diversity, we embrace the diverse, and we allow whether we create either forms of art that estrange the extrasensory brain or this social, political, economic, and cultural milieu. We estrange it, we feminize it, we queer it, whatever you want to call it. We create a different kind of brain. Or we take mushrooms and MDA or ayahuasca, and ayahuasca has a tremendous neuroplastic potential and acts at the synaptic level. If we alter our intracranial brains, but also with plant materials of plant consciousness and cosmology, and we allow the cosmos to enter into this diagram, because the extrasensory brain, the extracranial brain, is also the cosmos, and that's where a discussion of deep history, not going back to the not Homo erectus, the early man of 2 million years ago, but going even further back into plant consciousness, and where the inorganic and the organic, where the early actor networks, where inanimate and animate objects form to create the first forms of life. Yeah, if we go all the way back there, or we go into the other, we go to the microscopic, or we go to the macroscopic, to the cosmos, and that is affecting this extracranial brain. We have the potential to have a brain that is constantly able to change. And I will say one more thing: there are already drugs, I hate to say it, pharmaceuticals, because that's part of neural capitalism, is all of the new pharmaceuticals. There are pharmaceuticals now that are being given to children who have amblyopia. So, for instance, which is a problem with neuroplasticity. There are children who have crossed eyes. As I know you have a sister or a brother, an aunt or uncle, a friend whose kids have one. All of a sudden, they're patching one eye, and that's from preventing what's called suppression and amblyopia. When you have, for various reasons, an eye that is skewed, what's called strabismus, lazy eye, where the eye is greater than 4 degrees from the center. There's a 4 degrees difference between the left and the right eye. If the left eye, say, for instance, goes out 5 degrees or 6 degrees, or goes in 5 or 6 degrees, something called double vision occurs. And what happens is the stronger eye will suppress the weaker eye. And as a result, the weaker eye will go blind or partially blind. In an effort to prevent that, a patch is put over the stronger eye to make the weaker eye work, so that what the stronger eye does, if there is no patch, or if you don't catch this lazy eye soon enough, because some children don't have such a small amount of lazy eye that the parent doesn't even notice it, what can happen is that in this visual cortex, the stronger eye, just like in the cat cerebral cortex, it dominates. The inputs from the stronger eye stimulate the neurons that are directly related to the stronger eye at the expense of the weaker eye. And in the cortex, only the stronger eye will be represented. There's only a small window of neuroplasticity for this to happen. That's why children are more and more being operated on at earlier and earlier ages to make sure that that's corrected. And what happens is now they're able to they've been starting to use different drugs that are based on the serotonergic drugs that are hallucinatory. Those drug group is certain drugs are being used, the chemicals in them, the constituents of them, are being used to re-stimulate the neuroplasticity in the part of the brain where the eye has been suppressed, and this amblyopia is for the first time being changed.
Okay.
I think that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. I do have some questions here that are popping up, and okay. I'm going to urge you to...
Was that too long of an answer?
No, it's okay, but we should be finishing by now, so I don't want to leave anyone behind, so we're going to have to do it a bit more fast, I guess. So I think Francisco is the first person who wanted to ask a question, so we're ready for you, I think.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you for your talk, Warren. It was really cool. And I would like to ask you a question, which is, for example, if you consider classical music, you can distinguish between more quality or less quality, like in terms of performance. You can be a better or a not so good performer. And I'm just wondering if in noise art in general, could you also distinguish between what has more quality and what has less quality? How do we as spectators or we as artists can position ourselves in terms of how do we see this work?
Well, in noise, that's not really a consideration. I mean, it's not important for them, at least, the people that I know, the clubs that I go to, they're in Los Angeles, for instance. In Los Angeles, there's a really incredible community of noise spaces where you can go and artists that, like The Wolf. The Wolf is a really good one. If you ever go to LA, The Wolf. But there's a whole history of noise and noise music in LA. But anyway, that's not an important question to them. It's really not important. They don't care. Of course, like throbbing, there are interpreters like Radiohead and Throbbing Gristle and 9 Inch Nails and the whole Seattle music scene where noise and grunge, there's a connection. But those people who are really, really what I would call fervent believers in noise and noise culture, that's not an important question for them. It's more about the amateurness, the ability to experiment, and what that they're, of course, on the hand, famous. So I guess yes. Okay. I guess it's not so easy.
Thank you, Warren. So I think we're having a bit of a instability in our internet, but I think we can still hear Diogo, I hope. Can we still have his question, please?
Did somebody else? I didn't hear another question.
No,
Question?
It's not even.
Oh.
No.
Yep. Can you hear me, guys? Yeah?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think so. Let's see.
Yep. Okay. Awesome. So, hi, Warren. Hi, Cristina. Thank you for the most generous introduction. And Warren, thank you for this new teratomic trip. So I'd like to actually address your last point on the conversation with noise and regarding aspects of structure, sociality, the external brain, intelligibility, and meta-states in the sense of Luciana Pareti. So departing from the Hegelian functionalist notion of mind, something that does, instead of a thing that is, an intelligence as a feature of what is intelligible within a layered semantic structure. So noise would be a shapeless mass of potentiality not yet realized or beyond the being beyond the semantic bar or beyond the possibility of instrumentalization as such. And in addition of noise being a field of material potentials, it is also a field of possibilities as assembly methodologies. So if that's the case, wouldn't we, and regarding your notion of activism and praxis, wouldn't we be posed with a paradox? If a thing gets constructed from noise, then it's already within the radius of possible instrumentalization. If the thing is not constructed, arguably it cannot be yielded within the realm of intelligibility, or at least it would be too complex to not to be considered fatally ambiguous. So maybe time or speed in rendering forms from noise would seem to be the only escape to this loop, rendering teratomas before they can be turned into categories. So just as a provocation, is there a speed or even an accelerationist undertone in your thesis?
Well, I think that, I think that, well, your first comment is, something I also believe, that noise is a possibility, and that noise, like an archifossil, goes back before human beings could appreciate it. And noise, and that's where the power of noise comes in, because as noise is something that is really time specific and contextual, in the sense that a noisy situation in one socio-political, economic, historical condition is very different and promotes different kinds of information and is mutates in very, very different ways under different circumstances. So that something that is noisy in, like you were saying, in something that's noisy in one generation or one time period might not be noisy in another, or something that is noisy that had changed into something that was ordered and organized and understood in one environment could then revert to being noisy in the next environment. So for instance, you can look at that from a technological point of view, in the sense that there are certain kinds of information, like certain things. For instance, will there be a time when doing a bank, a real bank operation, or using cash will no longer be even something that we understand, or something, does it become sublime? Does analog technology, because, for instance, there's no longer a CD player or a CD-ROM outlet in a computer, does that, I'm using it as an analogy, does that CD-ROM, does that become noise? Does it become sublime? Or can it be reactivated in some other way? Or can it be used by an artist? Like for instance, noise artists really love to use antiquated, unusable technologies. I mean, that's one of the big things they do. They reinvent technologies and it's part of their practice. I mean, they do that on purpose. They're using these technologies that went out of, they use CDs and tape recorders. Tape recorders is like one of their most important things, but the general population is not using it. You know what I mean? No, sure. Yep. They're rediscovering when tape recorders came out originally, they did a certain thing and they weren't considered noisy, and they were playing music and it was part of a generalized cultural apparatus. it then becomes noisy today in a performative sense. And that kind of answers your question a little bit, right? Not maybe perfectly, but it does answer your question a little bit, right? Somehow.
We lost Diogo, probably, but Diogo did answer. So if it didn't, I'm sure we're going to have to. I think Diogo is asking to be unmuted because he wants to say something. Diogo, please, very fast. I do have to close this session, and so go on.
But anyway, Diogo, you can talk to. We can talk later if there's something. But okay, but let's have one. Why don't you make the final statement, Diogo?
No, I'll talk to you later. I wanted to, for the sake of politeness, not just be muted. And thank you for your answer. Probably I'll get back to you with that. Okay. So yeah, that would be that for now.
So I don't know about the others, but I'm kind of losing Diogo in this connection. So I did find it very interesting to see this in terms of time, that sound can be noise and then becomes music and then loses it again, and in different contexts can be different things. So it's a kind of plasticity in itself too. So I think I'm going to close the session. There was another question, but it was about the use of all these psychotropics. So I think you've answered that when you answered me. So I believe I can close it now, and I have to thank you really for how you prepared for this and how you answered our questions, and that was super interesting. And I think we have a handful for thinking and a lot of new tools to do that. So thank you, Warren, so much for being there and for doing this session.
It was really my pleasure. It was really my pleasure. And it's me who thanks you for participating as an audience and helping me to materialize my ideas. And thank you for that.
That's very generous. Thank you. So I think we're going to close this session now, and we're hoping to see you on the next session of this open Knowing Through Sound, this open program of Knowing Through Sound. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for us.
My pleasure. Have a good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.